Hello, everyone. My name is Chad Harris. I'm an archetypal astrologer. I've been studying astrology for 23 years. I've been studying with Richard Tarnas for the last 15 years here in San Francisco at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And our focus is on the planets, the archetypal meanings of the planets and their relationship to psychology, human psychology, of course. And a lot of it is focused on history and how the evolution of human consciousness is evolving and trying to understand where we're going in a little bit. So that's a little bit of the background. And today we're going to take a look at the really traumatizing events that have been happening here in the United States anyway over the past week, in particular, where there was a rash of mail bombings that thankfully didn't go off, but were sent to many of the Democratic people heads of targeted by Donald Trump's rhetoric. We're going to look at that. We're also going to look at the really sad situation of the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre, and we're finished with a look at the midterm election chart and what it might portend for the very important election coming up on Tuesday. So let's dive right in. And yeah, if you guys have any questions at any time, please feel free to chime in. So what's happening really is we're in a convergence, like a crossroads of two major cycles, the Uranus-Pluto cycle and the Saturn-Pluto cycle. And so the Uranus-Pluto cycle is a much longer cycle. There's like a decade-long interactions with the hard aspects. And the Saturn-Pluto cycles are more to 3 to 4 year alignments. And the Uranus-Pluto archetypal complex corresponds to radical, progressive, revolutionary periods in history, and the Saturn-Pluto complex corresponds to the contraction points, the crisis periods in history. So we're going through, like, the last decade is this radical, revolutionary impulse with lots of new transformational energies, and then we're just entering into a Saturn-Pluto conjunction that corresponds to the crisis points and contraction and moral conflicts that we've gone through over the past. What we'll look at is the past century. It goes back further in history, obviously, and so I think it'll be really helpful to understand what's happening today. And I'm curious to hear what you guys think too. So. We'll start here at the 1896-1907 Uranus opposition was the beginning of a lot of the abolitionist movements really started then, and a lot of the women's rights issues as well came at the turn of the century. And I could go through them, but let's just do it. W. Du Bois first organized the first Black protests, founded the Niagara Movement. Publication of the Souls of Black Folks in 1903. Booker T. Washington calls for the education of Black people. Women's Social and Political Union, 1903. You can see it's just the Women's Suffrage Association. There's lots of movements towards revolution, Uranus, and the impulse to transform comes from Pluto. So during the square, we had, I didn't mention, you also get the rise of radical totalitarian kind of impulses for power is Pluto as well. So the 30s had the socialist fascist kind of movement, the radical social movements that swept Europe, and the rise of Hitler and Stalin, the communist revolutions in Latin America, social reforms by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in response to the Great Depression. You can see that with like the liberal kind of emancipatory qualities and liberal democracy in a sense. And Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington led the Jazz Revolution, which it really accelerated the integration of African Americans into United States culture and society, because it allowed white people to let go of their defenses because they enjoyed the music and to socialize and to engage interactively with Black people. So it was powerful. If you watch Ken Burns' documentary on jazz, it's amazing evidence of just that. So in the 60s, from 1960 to 72, there was a Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And we had the civil rights movement, Malcolm X, the founding of the Black Panthers, Women's rights, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. The sexual revolution, gay rights movements began at Stonewall in 1969. Nelson Mandela begins social insurrections in South Africa. Cultural revolution in China, the flowering of rock and roll and the counterculture, Woodstock, all the major festivals. Radical anti-war protest movements throughout America, the rapid evolution of airplane technology, the first internet transmission, beginning of the space race in 61, and then we landed on the moon in 69. So you see this radical, transformation. Technological is also related to Uranus, but the movement towards freedom and breaking free of constraints, even the flight itself, the history of flight has a lot to do with Uranus and like breaking free of Saturnian constraints. So that's the archetypal feeling that we're experiencing. And this decade, from 2007 through 2020, you can see direct diachronic patternings, basically is what we call them. Diachronic meaning dia over time, chronos meaning time, and that from the 60s to now, the first time Uranus and Pluto have been in major aspect, you can see direct correlation. So the election of the first Black president after the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, gay marriage, widespread change in attitudes for legalization of marijuana, the Arab Spring and revolutionary Middle East uprisings, the Occupy Wall Street movement, first woman to win national political party nomination, first woman to win the popular vote in a national election, the Tea Party revolution, election of the first president never to hold political office, invention of the smartphone, entangled particles. I skipped the quantum stuff. Civilian space exploration continues. Revolutionary milestones took place during this decade. It's interesting, like Elon Musk and stuff. So like you can see the space race happening at the governments, but a lot of it's happened with civilian funding in this decade. And let's see, quantum computing, Chinese scientists put a rover on the moon, driverless cars, and possible early stages of blockchain currency revolution. Who knows if that's going to happen or not, but you can see these, those radical transformative energies that have taken place over this decade. We still have 2 years left, really. So this is Richard Tarnas on the Saturn-Pluto cycle. He says, the successive quadrature alignments of the Saturn and Pluto cycle coincided with especially challenging historical periods marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction, eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. These periods also corresponded with a tendency to establish an absolute boundary, Saturn, between the self and the other, whether defined by nationality, religion, race, class, caste, gender, sexual orientation, belief system, or any other category, was then perceived as radically separate and alien, sometimes as subhuman and not worthy of life. So I don't know if you guys can feel or resonate with what he's saying here, but I certainly am. I feel like there's a real pullback happening at this moment. The Saturn-Pluto conjunction with, let's see, we'll go through it in just a second, actually. So this is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1913 to 16. It corresponded to World War I. Over 16 million people killed in the war itself. Initiates massive shift in political power dynamics around the world, and is also the founding of the Federal Reserve, which we'll see what's happening with that now, maybe. Okay, in 1930 through 33 was a Saturn-Pluto opposition, corresponded to the Great Depression, the rise of the Nazi Party, the Reichstag fire, and the beginning of Hitler's dictatorship. Stalin begins starvation of 7 million Ukrainians, the rise of Japanese military, invasion of Manchuria and China. The Saturn-Pluto square of 1939 to 41 corresponded to Hitler's invasion of Poland and the beginning of World War II, the Blitzkrieg and the fall of France, the beginning of the final solution and the Holocaust, murders over 11 million people, beginning of the Manhattan Project, which could potentially end life as we know it on Earth now with the amount of nuclear weapons we have, which annihilation is Pluto, Saturn is totality, so total life destruction. It's just an absolute worst case scenario. But you can see these multiple ways in which the Saturn and Pluto archetypes are coming together. Now, in 1946-48, there's another conjunction. So like World War I's a conjunction, and then the end of World War II is a conjunction. So that's the beginning and the end of a cycle. And so it's the beginning of the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, retraction of the British Empire after World War II, and the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union, establishment of the Iron Curtain, establishment of the CIA, the beginning of the modern era of terrorism with the Zionist Irgun bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946, the first Arab-Israeli war, the founding of Israel in 1948, and India and Pakistan in the war that divided them in 1947, and apartheid is instituted in South Africa. So, yeah, it's interesting with the conjunction because you can see like as a cycle, World War I, it's like the nationalist identities move towards conflict because the boundaries that we place and we tend to become intensified with Pluto, and we tend to project evil or what we don't, or what we repress about ourselves, Pluto, onto what's outside of our boundaries, onto the other. And there's a lot of fear, Saturn, of the other, of the Plutonic, of what we don't want to see about ourselves or about what we fear in others. So you can see, again, those energy, those complexes coming through. So the next square was in 1954 to 57. It was the second Arab-Israeli conflict, the Suez Canal War in 1956. Soviet Union reoccupies Hungary. The Soviet Union crushes an uprising in Poland as well. And 64 through 68 was a massive escalation in the Vietnam War. That's really when it technically started in 60 or 61, but we put over 500,000 troops in 64, 65 during the Saturn-Pluto opposition. And the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War, 67, nearly 1 million Indonesians slaughtered by right-wing militias, barbaric terrorism, Mao's Red Guard in China. And the Saturn-Pluto square of 73 to 75 corresponded to the Watergate crisis. You also can see a constitutional crisis corresponding to Saturn-Pluto. Constitution is Saturn, and crisis Saturn, and Pluto is intensifying it, and the power struggle that it entailed. So the U.S. was defeated in Vietnam, over 1 million Cambodians slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge after we pulled out. The Yom Kippur War in 1973, and the energy crisis that resulted from that in the United States, which led to, it led to Carter being elected, actually. But so anyway, the CIA overthrew the Chilean government, inserting Augusto Pinochet as dictator on September 11th, 1973. I just thought that was interesting. So the CIA overthrowing Chilean government, the United States, according to Wikipedia, has been involved in in supporting coups or overthrows of governments in 80 countries around the world in the last 100 years or so. So that's almost half the countries in the world. And obviously this happened to us in 2016, but it's kind of like blowback. We've been doing this around the world for a long time. So, but in 1984 was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and it corresponded to the first fundamentalist Islamic suicide attack against the West. It was the Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon in 1983. And this also corresponded to the Iraq War, began then. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1980 and corresponded to the creation of Hezbollah. Reagan deregulated the banks. This is interesting because of where we are coming to now. And beginning of the United States experiment in the credit economy. I think credit cards were invented in the late 70s, but they really took on, it started in the 80s. So this is an experiment. Credit cards and economies built on credit is not something that was, I don't think, was done throughout history. So we're working out and something new, it seems. So in 1992 was the next, was the waning, it's the first square after the conjunction of 83. And it corresponded to the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Forget his name, but it was the first World Trade Center attack. Hamas began suicide bombings in Israel and in 1993, and bin Laden called for jihad against the United States. Bill Clinton actually instituted an assault weapons ban, and which you can see a weapons ban is Saturn, and the assault weapon is Pluto. But it was a conservative pullback. This is when the Republicans took over Congress, and from what I read, it was in large part that when they did the exit polls from the people who voted, the number one reason they voted for Republicans against Clinton in the House was because of the assault weapons ban. So it was like a backlash against him wanting to ban assault weapons, and it ended up being a Republican sweep of the Congress. So this also corresponded to the genocide in Rwanda and the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So in 2000 to 2004 corresponded to the 9/11 World Trade Center attacks, and the insinuating wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Putin assumed power in Russia. He conducted a war in Chechnya, the Patriot Act, an NSA Total Information Awareness Act. This is they wanted to know everything, and they were spying on us. An invasion of personal liberties, later revealed by Edward Snowden. And this is also when the pedophilia scandal from the Catholic Church was revealed. You can see that as like, the predatory nature of Pluto, and Saturn is the moral confrontation and the revealing of the shadow, and the confrontation with the shadow, but revealing of it, a moral accounting of the dark and repressed pedophilia issues that the Catholic Church are dealing with. And it's interesting, we'll get there in a second. So the next alignment was the last square that we just had from 2008 through 2011, corresponded to the subprime mortgage, economic collapse, the worst recession since the Great Depression, Obama's surge in Afghanistan, the Syrian civil war began, over 500,000 casualties, 11 million people displaced, largest refugee crisis in the 1930s, which pretty much led to Brexit and immigration fears across Europe. And now, this is what's happening now, and you can feel it. There's a widespread conservative authoritarian consolidation of power from Russia, China, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, just last week in Brazil, and in Saudi Arabia. Possible trade war, possible constitutional crisis in the United States, intense partisan division, border wall, immigration issues, Catholic Church revelations in Pennsylvania and in Australia, civil war, rhetoric in the United States clearly, and a bit of a cyber war with Russia, even though we're not really attacking them, it seems. And Trump is definitely laying the groundwork to go to war with Iran. Whether or not that's going to happen or not, I don't know, but they are definitely laying the groundwork for it. It's part of what's happening with the Jamal Khashoggi issue, and we'll talk about that. So, and a possible restructuring of the world order. I mean, like the United States is kind of pulling back from its, position of dominance or wanting to lead the world, whereas Trump is saying, I'm a nationalist and we're going to worry about ourselves. And you see that same retraction, the conservative pullback is Saturn, and it's intensified by Pluto. And so the potential for more strife and conflict is it's clear, because if you're codifying your boundaries and you're projecting evil onto the other, it ends up not in a good situation. So, so this is, I guess, Jair Bolsonaro. I don't know how to pronounce it yet. He's the newly elected president of Brazil, and he's born with Pluto square Saturn and Mars in a T-square, really. This is an 8-degree square. It's a big grand cross, actually, with the moon. We don't know exactly where the moon is. It's a noon chart. It could be 7 degrees on either side of this. But either way, he's born with a moon-Pluto opposition. And this guy's like one of the most blatant misogynists, that I've seen come to political power ever. So in my lifetime, anyway. But anyway, that it's just interesting that he's a very conservative right-wing. He wants to industrialize the Amazon. Anyway, I don't know that much about him, but it's pretty scary. So anyway, I just wanted to maybe, if that makes sense. So this is maybe the last thing I'll say, because if we go back to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction prior to World War I, it was in early 1880s. 1882 was the first Immigration Act, and it was against Chinese people. So the Chinese were excluded. They didn't have rights. amongst the United States citizens in the same way. So it's interesting that the first Immigration Act that the United States actually ever put into place happened during a Saturn-Pluto conjunction as well. So maybe that's a good place just to pause for a second and see if you guys have any questions about the historical correlations that, you know, are leading somewhat to where we're at and where we're going. If not, I'll just keep going.
Yes, I have a question. So
Sure.
Saturn-Pluto are now approaching an exact conjunction, and so they're now in the balsamic phase. What about the balsamic phase? What can you tell us about that?
That's interesting. You know, like, I wish I knew. Balsamic, does it start at the semi-square? Is it 45 degrees and towards the conjunction? Is that balsamic, the last, or is it, how is it defined? Is it like the last 10 degrees or last? Anyway, either way.
I'm just counting it up now. It's about 45 or something like that.
Yeah, like the semi-square. That makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about it that deeply. I would say though that most likely we could go back to that point and look at some of the things that were happening when it was 45 degrees away and see what that was portending for the conjunction that we're in now, and which lasts. What's that?
I just said right. Yes. And also, like, when so Pluto now is what, about 18, 19, 20, something like that. Yeah. And Saturn's at about 4 degrees Capricorn. So when Saturn moves to about 8 or 9 degrees, then it will be officially, from an EA point of view, a conjunction. And so we'll approach, yeah.
Right. So it's interesting that it went to 9 degrees earlier and stationed there.
Right.
And then it's retrograded back to 2, and now it's back to 4.
Can you remember what happened at that 9 degrees? It was...
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was around, wait, no, God, I wish I...
If I give you some dates, would you be able to?
I can't do it off the top of my head, but
no, don't worry about it. It's okay.
I do remember it being an issue, like because Don Jr.'s sun is 9 degrees Capricorn. Sean Hannity's sun is 9 degrees Capricorn. Somebody else, not Kushner, maybe Jared. There's several, and there was something that happened right when Saturn went to that stage. I'm not remembering right now what it was, but it's a good question. That's definitely the way we see it working. But with the archetypal perspective, we would say that the conjunction started, you know, like if you're saying wherever your orb you start with, it starts then, even if it moves out of orb after that, it's still the energy is still in the field.
Wow,
That's why we get these larger orbs of years from 2017 through 2021, because we calculate it as it first moves into the orb, and then even if it moves out, it's still, the field has been activated. And so, and that comes from Rick's research, you know. It was mostly out of Rick's research in particular that he noticed that was taking place. So
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I think there's an example we'll get to in a minute that'll help clarify that a little bit more too, I think. So yeah, Bolsonaro, well, bad news. And so Trump, you know, I actually just did an analysis of him. It's on my YouTube channel, Archetypal View, if you want to look at it. But I'm not going to go through his whole chart. I'm just going to focus on the part that is problematic right now, which is the fact that he's born with Mars rising, and he's born with Pluto at the exact midpoint of Saturn and Mars. And so he's born at the very beginning of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that closed the end of World War II, the 46 to 48. So he's born at the beginning of that conjunction. But with Pluto at the midpoint of Mars, it's 10 degrees and 14 minutes of Leo. So it's just, almost exact. So what's happening here is this is the intensity of fight that he has, Mars, and the resistance, Saturn, that he expresses in the way that Mars Saturn has a tendency to, when it gets punched, to fight back. It's a resistance energy. It's a constant battling, wants to resist whatever constraint or slight it feels as though it's having. And then Pluto gives it an extra level of vengeance in a sense, and intensity and prolificness in a sense. I mean, it's nonstop. You see, actually, with Mars Pluto people, just by itself, people have a lot of energy. People who don't sleep a lot. He doesn't sleep a lot. I mean, he has tremendous energy for being 70 years old, and he's kind of relentless. It's a relentless energy, Mars and Pluto. It tends. I mean, it doesn't have to be negative either. I mean, you could be a relentless painter or athlete, long distance runners. I mean, it doesn't have to come through in this type of real shadow way. But just this week, he declared himself a nationalist, just straight up. And he only left out the fact that he was white. And he proposed legislation to define transgender people out of existence. They just don't exist. There's only male and female. And so think about what Rick was saying before about, othering, and so much so that they're subhuman, they're not even really human. I mean, this is where we're getting with our divisiveness and the way we're othering each other and dehumanizing each other. That's the Plutonic. Pluto relates to nature, and that's why you get the vermin or the rats, the infestation. It's it's nature in its primal, instinctual, animalistic way that what is being feared by the Saturnian purity that's inside of your boundaries, that you have your nation or your world or your identity or whatever it is that you're overly identifying with as your sense of separateness. But anyway, he accused George Soros of funding the caravan. There's a migrant caravan coming from Central America, coming from Honduras mostly, which is a war-torn nation that we've been largely responsible for not helping out, at least I'll just say that. And he actually proposed the end of birthright citizenship in the United States. So if you come here and you have a child, that child is no longer necessarily a United States citizen as it is ingrained in the Constitution today. So he doesn't have the real right to do this, but anyway, he's claiming that he wants to do it, and it's a political stunt basically to get more people to vote for Republican. So this is Robert Bauer's chart. He was the shooter at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and he's born with a Mars Sun conjunction at the midpoint of Mercury and Pluto, and it's square to Saturn. So all the same combinations, Mars, Pluto, Saturn, and Mercury with the mind there, it's kind of focused and intensified. Pluto gives it an intensification. And then we should also, I didn't mark it, but Mercury is also square to Neptune. Trump is also born with this. In its shadow side, it can be delusional thinking. Mercury, the mind. So Mercury, the mind, and Neptune are imagination, and the stream and flow of consciousness. It's reality in the sense of what we think is real, but Saturn is consensus reality. Neptune can be your reality and what your imagination is believing, but it's not necessarily what everyone else is believing. This is where I'll point to Linda. He's actually born with Saturn opposite Neptune. It's not, you can't see it in this chart, but it had already gone by once. It is operative from 70 through 73, and then it stations actually, I think, around 19 and goes back to within 6 degrees of opposition to Neptune, and then it moves out. So he's actually born with a Saturn Neptune opposition as well, even though it's not indicated. And like Saturn Neptune can be like the Dalai Lama has it, Gandhi had it, Martin Luther King had it, and it can be like a real spiritual devotion. Neptune spirit and devotion Saturn, and the devotion to bring the ideal Neptune into reality, to bring heaven or to bring one's aspirations. A lot of artists have it as well, to bring the ideal image or whatever music into form. But its shadow side is can be nihilism, like where Neptune is transcendent meaning, a sense of spiritual transcendence, but Saturn can negate it. Like it can just cut it off to where there's like a disbelief, like you don't believe in any transcendent phenomenon, or just a pessimistic outlook on life, because Neptune relating to the stream and flow of consciousness, and Saturn can pathologize that and make the stream and flow of consciousness more pessimistic, more negative, more doubtful, and in his case, caught up really in a delusional fantasy, as we're about to see. So on October 27th, he went into the Tree of Life synagogue and murdered 11 people. Anyway, and he had Saturn square to his natal Pluto at the time. Mars was in a trine to natal Saturn, and Pluto was in a trine to natal Mars. So like the Saturn square Pluto, that's the like pressure. Feels like a constriction, feels like a no exit situation. It can be, it doesn't have to feel that way. It can be hard work and discipline, and you're just doing really great things that are just take a lot of effort and stuff. But it can feel like you're in some type of vice, like a constraint, and you can't get out of it, and you reach a breaking point, it seems, as he did. So this is his comments on Gab, which is a social media platform I'm not familiar with, but he says, I took some of this from news articles. He says, like Trump, Bowers complained about the caravan of Central American migrants moving through Mexico. On Gab, he wrote that the migrant invaders were coming to the United States to commit violent acts. He blamed the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society HIAS for bringing the invaders to kill our people. Bowers repeatedly called them invaders on his Gab post. I have noticed a change in the people saying illegals that are now saying invaders, read one post. 6 days before the shooting, I like this, Bowers said. His last post before entering the synagogue read, I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. And so it's interesting because like Trump and Fox News switched about 2 weeks prior from calling them migrants to calling them invaders, like that we were being invaded, and now Trump is like sending the military down there to like, because he's trying to bring fear into the populace that there's, these migrant immigrants that are coming to infest us or whatever. So it seems as though Bauer, in his delusional state, was taking what the right-wing news medias were saying. He took it too seriously, and he ended up committing the massacre. So he's not actually a Trump supporter. He felt like Trump was too close to Jews. So he came out and said that like right away, but he was clearly inspired by a lot of the right-wing rhetoric and discourse that's on Fox and on right-wing radio here in the States. And so this is Cesar. Oh, wait, was there a question before? Did someone have a question?
Oh, there was someone making a comment in the chat. She said she could see a Star of David in the center of his chart, described by the aspect lines.
Aha.
That one, yeah. Yeah, not quite. There's one section missing.
Right. Fascinating. Oh, she might have been talking about this. This would have been the transits.
That one,
yeah.
Yes.
So, right. This would have been Grand Trine here, Uranus, Mars, and Saturn. And then Jupiter, Uranus, and the other leg would be Mercury. Wow, that's pretty interesting. Mercury, Jupiter, Uranus.
I've never seen Saturn. It so negative, like such a negative.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the thing with Trump. Even it's like he has Sun trine Jupiter, and you don't normally see like this hubris and arrogance with the trine necessarily. I mean it can be, but you usually see it more with the square where it's challenging. The Jupiter's like, oh, it's more of a radiant kind of generosity and stuff. But he even the trines in his chart are he seems to embody in a shadow way. Of course, this is my opinion. This is my bias. There are many ways to see this, and it's not that my way of seeing it's the most true or accurate or whatever. Because like clearly, a lot of other people see him very differently, um, and that's the nature of reality. It seems. Um, is there
Yeah.
another question?
Yes, please. Going back to the one that you had before, the transits chart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I noticed that there are 3 Mars aspects transits. So we've got Mars, the Mars Saturn, the Pluto Mars, and the Saturn Pluto. So
Mm-hmm.
there are 3 aspects, and this equals an event occurring. So it's a Martian event. And
Mm-hmm.
as for the Star of David, I'm still not sure about that, but definitely a Martian event occurring.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And the one thing I left out actually is Neptune is opposite is Mars, exactly, and
Oh, and
Sun,
another
which
one. Oh gosh.
is delusional,
Yeah,
like yeah,
yeah,
violent act.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, wow. Thanks, Linda.
Oh, I do have one more question. You did mention before that Saturn is consensus reality. And I'm just thinking, sure, there's the consensus reality, of the collective, but what about the
Mm-hmm.
individualized reality of Saturn? And so it would be where one is fixed and crystallized within themselves, right?
Sure, that's one aspect of it. Is yeah, you can be fixed, fearful, doubtful. It's yeah that part of us that uh, struggles potentially with interacting with the world because it has to do with how we are incarnate and how we're of service. Like how I say collective like consensus reality, but it's like how do I show up? How am I of service? It's all of those things too. And so it seems as though the accounting, like the sense of how we relate on the physical plane, and I'm just I'm kind of riffing here. It seems like that's a big like almost central to what's happening right now. Like it's the way we relate to each other and the way we relate to the world that is problematic in a sense and going through a lot of transformation.
Yes.
Um,
But doesn't that stem from how one relates to oneself? The
yeah, absolutely.
crystallized Saturn, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And how we see ourselves in the world is really important to how we create our worldview. Um, like, unfortunately, the modern worldview sees us as an insignificant planet with no meaning, and the universe is no meaning either. And that if we think there's meaning in the universe outside of ourselves, that we're projecting that from a naive, childlike need, and that that sense of self, if that's our identity, if that's how we see ourselves in the world, disconnected from any sense of larger purpose, then who are we and what do we do? What do we mean? Who are we supposed to be? Um, the Copernican revolution and how it dethroned the religions basically because they were all saying we were the center of the universe and we realized we weren't. Since then, our identity is up for grabs. It's like we're evolving into a new form of human being in essence. And I think what I should say maybe here is that was what I was pointing to so much of is about the divisiveness that we're experiencing and that Trump is like purveying. That perspective that we're separate is actually an illusion. we're not actually separate from the world. We're not separate from each other. And this is what astrology demonstrates. It demonstrates that we're not separate. We're not only are we not separate from each other, we're not separate from the planets. Like the largest patterns in nature that we're aware of, far away as Pluto, millions and millions of miles away, is intimately connected to the depth of the human psyche. Like, so our identity, how we see ourselves, is crucial to what we think of our worldview, how we see what is the world, what is meaning in the world, and how are we relating to it. And right now, we're going through, I think, like a 500-year birth canal that's trying to forge a new autonomy in the human being. And the astrological perspective provides the capacity to move into that new relationship, so that we're not an isolated, insignificant planet or being. Astrology says that we're meant to be here, and you have a capacity to have a relationship with the depth of who we are that's connected. It's commensurate with the movements of the large, with the universe, with the cosmos, with the heavens. So like, it's a relationship, it seems, that's striving to be forged, that we can see ourselves more clearly and more objective, or more self-critically and objectively, in a sense, in relationship to the whole. And like we can see, like when we look at Donald Trump's chart, I think I've said this in the past, but like I feel like the reason he embodies such the shadow dimension of himself is because he doesn't look at himself self-critically. Critical self-reflection is the key to psychology. And he doesn't do that. He can never be wrong. That's why he constantly projects the shadow of who he is, because he never looks at it and never thinks he's wrong. So that it's always coming out. And this is what astrology can help us do. It can help us see ourselves and how we're participating, how we're in the archetypes, and and how they're connected to the depth of our soul ultimately, and how our soul is participating in it. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that was great. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Very, very welcome.
I love it.
Maybe we'll touch back on to it in a minute.
Okay.
So this is Cesar Sayoc Jr., the mail bomber. What am I doing on time? Oh, shoot, 15 minutes. All right. Yeah, good. We're almost done. We're good. Okay. So this is a really unfortunate situation. He's, I mean, it's not nearly as bad as the last one, but Cesar Sayoc Jr. was abandoned by his father when he was a child. And so he grew up without a sense of a parental figure and identity in that way. And he basically, he wasn't a Republican until Donald Trump started to run for president. And then he latched on to Donald Trump's message. And in a sense, it seems as though he kind of was like a replacement father figure in a sense, almost, because he's so identified with him that well, you'll see in a second. But his chart, he's born with the Saturn-Neptune square, which, like I said before, can correspond to psychological disturbances. And he's born with a Mars-Mercury conjunction, really tight, opposite Pluto, just 4 degrees. And in 2002, he was arrested for making bomb threat against the electric company. They threatened to shut off his power, and he just was like, whatever, I'll fucking bomb you, blah, blah, blah. And so he got arrested for that. He had been arrested like 8 other times for different things. So he had issues, aggressive issues, but also just psychological disturbances. And so let's see. What he was arrested for was he mailed 15 bombs to President Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, George Soros, people who are on Donald Trump's like hit list, his greatest hits, the people he constantly rails against. That's who he sent the bombs to. So this is him, Cesar Sayoc, and this is his van. So in 2015, there's pictures of his van, white, nothing on it, and then when Donald Trump runs for president, he becomes like, mad with him. And here's a sign that's real close up. You see the targets on Obama and Hillary, Michael Moore, and the CNN sucks. He sent 2 or 3 bombs to CNN, and John Brennan. So like he got into this delusional place and basically took up Trump's rhetoric and felt like he would, take care of business for all the people that Trump didn't like. And so he got the addresses for all of these people and built 6-inch pipe bombs, but he didn't know how to build them correctly. And so they didn't go off. And he mailed them to all of these people. And for the last week, it was 4 or 5 days, we're all like, whoa, what's going to happen here? And it's interesting. So I mentioned he has a Mars, Mercury, Pluto, and so Saturn was square to the sun. But this is where I'm going to do a little. Okay, this is his natal chart on the inside and where the transits are today on the outside. And what I'm going to do is go back in weeks, because what happened was we just went through a Mars retrograde period. And it's really interesting if you look at what happened here, because if you go back to June, I don't know how long he was planning. It'll be really interesting to see when the evidence comes out how long he'd been working on this. But because this is what happened, because you go back to June and Mars comes into conjunction with Saturn here, and then it stations just outside of it at 9, goes back to really almost a conjunction with Pluto. And this is already a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. It's kind of like a big field, Mars, Saturn, Pluto again. And then it goes back across to Saturn, and October 22nd is when the first bomb was mailed or received. So it'll be really interesting to see when the details come out, like how long he'd been planning it, whatnot. But the Mars-Saturn, retrograding across that part of his chart made perfect sense. So let's see. The right one? Here we go. Yeah, so, okay. This is the most important story, and I only have 5 minutes. This is really lame. Sorry I went so long. Okay, Jamal Khashoggi was a Saudi Arabian citizen, but he was a resident of the United States, and he was a journalist, and he was actually part of the Saudi establishment for a long time. But he had been a progressive, and he was critical of bin Salman, the crown prince, who's going to be king of Saudi Arabia. So what Khashoggi did was he tried to go get marriage papers from the consulate in Turkey so that he could marry a Turkish woman. And he was scared about going there. He was fearful because of bin Salman had been the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He'd been consolidating power for the last 2 years. And in November of 2017, he arrested one of the wealthiest people in Saudi Arabia and did it, I think, because he was a Trump critic. And they did it as an anti-corruption campaign. So anyway, the point is that like Crown Prince is consolidating power, and Jamal Khashoggi is probably the most prominent journalist that had been progressive and critical of the Crown Prince. So he walks into the consulate in in Istanbul in Turkey to retrieve his papers so he can get married. And what we now know is that he was immediately strangled, and they killed him and dismembered his body, and either melted it in acid or it's buried somewhere. They don't know. But it's interesting because Pluto was exactly square to his sun, and this is a literal interpretation, but the Plutonic can be literal dismemberment. It's like the shamanic descent, and in the shamanic traditions, dismemberment is a part of the process, and it's probably a psychological, ultimately, it's a psychological dismemberment that's happening in the Plutonic descent, but the symbolism is actually literal in this situation where he was literally killed and dismembered. He was also in his second Saturn return. And then this has been Mohammed bin Salman's chart. Mercury, Mars conjunction, square Saturn. And then look at this. This is the South Node. It's right in the middle of Pluto and Saturn. So he's born at the end of the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And his South Node being in between there, I feel like this is probably part of why he is going to be king, because the South Node being our past and what we're used to, what we're familiar with, what we've done in past lives, And the Saturn-Pluto, it's like he's been the authority, he's been the dictator, and that's what he's doing. He's consolidating power, and it's the reason he killed Jamal Khashoggi. Like, he killed him specifically, and he did it, I think, kind of publicly in a sense, because it was not, it was going to be known how it happened eventually. I mean, they were going to try and disappear him or whatever, but eventually it would be known that they killed him, and they did it to strike fear into the hearts of any journalist in Saudi Arabia to not stand up to Salman as he becomes king over the next several years. So he's bin Salman's the architect of the war in Yemen. I just read today that they're expecting potentially 10 million people to starve to death there in the next year and a half. So, like, if nothing changes, so he's it's some really horrible things that are going on. I don't want to miss up time, and I also want to ask if there's any other questions. Oh, because this is really interesting. This has been Salman's transits for when he murdered Khashoggi, and he had Jupiter tightly, conjunct Saturn, but it's square to his natal Mars, and then Mars in the sky, conjoining his natal Jupiter. Oh, it's interesting because this is that Mars retrograde period, so it had been there for a long time. And what I felt like when I initially just saw it was like, he committed this, horrific murder, and he did it because he knew Trump would let him get away with it. Like, there's a $1 billion arms deal on the table or something. bin Salman and Jared Kushner are close. They'd already been working together. And really what's happening is they're supporting Saudi Arabia. We've always supported Saudi Arabia, but they're doing it more so now, it seems, because they're basically laying the groundwork to go to war with Iran. In the last United Nations, when John Bolton went there and stuff, they did all these things to pull back. The sanctions start, I think, November 4th. So Iran's about to have economic sanctions. Their economy is going down because we keep attacking it, in essence, and causing disruption there. And ultimately they want regime change, I imagine. But the idea is that the Saudis are going to actually side with Israel and go against the Iranians. So I don't know what's going to happen, but it doesn't look good. I mean, with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction coming up, and John Bolton as a national security advisor, I was going to put his chart into it. It's not good either. Okay, the midterm elections. Sorry, last 5 minutes. This is potentially really awesome. Uranus in the sky is in opposition to Moon-Venus conjunction, and there's a Jupiter-Mercury conjunction in the sky. So it seems like this is going to be the largest turnout in history for any midterm election ever. And I'm guessing that there will most likely be more women that vote in the history of midterms as well. But I'm curious to see, in the end, how that works out, because I mean, clearly the misogyny that it's coming out of, and just the misogyny, with the lack of empathy, and he has no feminine values. He has no relational values. He's not a family man, and it's hard for me to see how so many women really can identify with it. And oh geez, even that's critical. I don't mean to be. But yeah, anyway, this is clearly the most important midterm election that we've ever had. We're about to either begin impeachment processes of some form, investigations that'll happen if the Democrats take the House, or if the Republicans do, and there's no investigations, then the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is like this huge symbol for the rest of the world that any other dictator can basically murder their journalist and get away with it, because we're not really going to do anything about it. And that's I don't know. It's frightening to me. It feels like the portends of larger conflicts to come. But anyway, that was the little bit that I had on the election. I don't do predictions. I mean, the Saturn-Pluto is going to color the next 3 years, irrespective of who wins. It's going to be intense, challenging, but a moral development. There's a real strong moral development that takes place when we confront our shadow, which is what's happening. Like, Trump represents the shadow of the white European male psychology. and it's in our face, and hopefully we're learning from it. Hopefully there'll be more people learning from it and not wanting to go in that direction than there are people who are identifying with it and moving along those lines. But it seems like it's this tug of war, and the Saturn-Pluto energy is actually what's coloring our psyche. I mean, it's why people, I think, are becoming more fearful and projecting more evil, and there's more that tendency to other and split, and to not want immigrants. And the last thing I'll say, I guess, because we're really out of time, but this is a little different than the rest of history, because before there was more room, in a sense, and now there's not. Like, literally, there's nowhere else to go. We've colonized the world. There's too many people, and the ice is melting. So the weather climate contractions, a lot of the immigration is not just from the war in Syria and stuff. It's actually people fleeing the heat and the lack of things growing properly and around the equator. So like, that's going to continue to happen. There's going to be more and more immigration. So it's a matter of how we deal with this. Are we going to be fearful and other and say they're not human or whatever and not deserve rights, whatever? I mean, so like, I just feel like the astrological perspective, it cuts through all of those lines. Like, there are no divisions. There's no Honduran or American or woman or man or anything. You're just a human being, and you have this deep connection to transcendent principles, and it seems to cut through all of those lines. And so I feel like it indicates that we're all here together, we're all in it, and on the ship together, and we should take care of each other and love each other and not demonize and dehumanize other people. So anyway, any questions? Sorry, I only left a minute or two. Hi.
I have a comment.
Please.
I saw on that chart that the moon, that was a noon chart, and so the moon will go from all the way through that grand square,
Mm-hmm.
and like hopefully instigate the change.
Yeah.
That we need to see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is very, very thought-provoking, very informative, a lot of fun. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome, Sue. I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Okay, any final questions, comments?
Well, I was very impressed with all the information that we just received. I mean, it's so much to process, but I mean, I'm amazed at all the knowledge and, the history, the psychology, like the depth of this, this research is amazing. I'm really impressed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It is impressive, isn't it? I mean, it's not me. Like, Rick Tarnas is, I learned most everything from him, but it's the evidence that's impressive. It's the fact. I mean, what astrology seems to be doing is it's measuring, in a sense, or it's a capacity to measure how consciousness is participating in history. Like, if the 60s, the Uranus-Pluto energy, radically revolutionary energy, we're all participating in that. If you live through it, you're literally participating in those archetypal complex, in that relationship. And that seems to also be what's happening now. And it helps us understand why there is such a radical conservative pullback happening at the moment, and they tend to go in these ebbs and flows, because you have this radical revolutionary decade with the first Black president, and then we get the racist backlash, the conservative pullback, like, what? None of that, that's too progressive, that kind of thing. So it's this dance that seems to be happening throughout history between progress and, conservative. And not that, they're both necessary. There's really important parts of Saturn-Pluto, like the Catholic Church scandal coming to light and stuff, the Me Too movement, and hopefully more gun rights, or gun laws, to because there's a lot of positive moral development that takes place in Saturn-Pluto. I mean, after the Holocaust, no more genocide, right? I mean, that's what we supposedly learned. But yeah, so thank you so much, Marie. I really appreciate all that. It's really, really a lot of great feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chad. Perhaps you'd like to do a meeting on positive moral development.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I know. That would be great. I know. I focus so much on the negative because this is what
That's
has
okay.
happening.
That's okay. Yeah.
Right? And, but I'm doing it because the evidence is there, and I'm trying to point towards it and say, hey, but you're right. That is where we want to go. It's towards the positive, and
but you're right too, because we learned so much today, and that was so important. So looking forward very much to having you again. Would you all please thank Chad Harris, everyone?
Thank you. Fascinating.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Chad. That was great, as always.
Thank you so much, Juan.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sue.
Yeah, thank you. Hope to see you soon again.
Yes, thank you, Marie. Likewise.